Welcome everyone to San Gimignano Lichtenberg. I'm very happy to have you here tonight. I'm very happy to welcome everyone that is here on site and everyone that is currently watching in the live stream. We are online now, that is amazing. And yeah, my name is Angelika Hinterbrandner. I'm part of the Brandlupe Plus B Plus team. We call this place our workshop. We basically just moved in. As you can see, there are still boxes. We're going to use this place as a workshop, not only to work on prototypes, but as well to think about new strategies. And that's why we are here today as well, to think about new models in the built environment. And I'm very happy to have so many people here that are listening and interested in the topic. Thanks as well to the Berlin Questions team, especially to Ludwig and Lutz that invited us as a team to be part of this event and that made it possible that you are here tonight. So a big applause to the whole team. Thank you very much. And I would like to hand over the microphone now directly to the Deputy Mayor Ramona Popp, who will give us a short introduction. And I'm very much looking forward to her words. Welcome, Ramona Popp.
So hello everybody, it's nice to see you here, it's nice to have you here, the sun is coming, everything is great in Berlin. Welcome you to Berlin-Lichtenberg. This setting here reflects, I think, very much the essence of Berlin, making creative use of the heritage left by our city's troubled past. You know, after war, division, falling of the wall, and industrialization, the people of Berlin did not just rebuild what once was, despite the Schloss, but it's another topic. We welcomed inventive minds from across the globe and reinvented an economy driven by innovation here in Berlin. The COVID-19 pandemic adds another chapter to Berlin's story. Our renowned clubs, culture scene, and tourism industry were hit particularly hard by the closures and their restrictions. At the same time, many local tech companies and startups continue to strive. The pandemic has challenged our assumptions about the pace of possible changes. We were forced to hit pause and then fast forward to reorganize our work and social life. So this is the right time and the place to talk about how to continue transforming our economy and come back after this crisis. For me, it's essential that the lessons from the COVID-19 crisis are not lost on policymakers and practitioners discussing how to contain the climate crisis. The dramatic pictures of floods and wildfires on the news highlight once again the urgency of taking action. Metropolitan areas like Berlin play an ambivalent role. Our dense population and built environments can facilitate the spread of diseases and drive up temperatures. But at the same time, it's the researchers here, civil society organizations and entrepreneurs in precisely those big cities that help policymakers find the solutions to the problems ahead. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on such solutions today. From my perspective as Senator for the Economy here in Berlin, there are three main learnings from COVID that give me a lot of hope for the future. First, individuals, businesses, and the state can adapt quickly to new circumstances. Crises aggregate inequalities, but we have instruments to mitigate those effects. And third, strategic investments in transformation strengthen resilience and sustainable growth. Firstly, our ability to adapt is really impressive. Experiences with COVID-19 have been painful and unequal across the globe. We are fortunate that we can be here together with a small group in person, not that small, today or tonight. This public health crisis took us by surprise, but when the scale became clear, it was all hands on deck. Physical contacts were reduced across the economy and society. This had negative effects of businesses, social life, and education, but went a long way not to leave no one behind. Neighbors showed solidarity, helped each other with their shopping. Small shops and restaurants set up websites to continue selling their products online and to go. The state of Berlin and the federal government in Germany swiftly put in place massive aid packages to compensate for companies and freelancers, lost revenue, and retain employees. As the crisis moved on, sport venues become vaccination centers, clubs become test stations, and new apps were created. With public funding and private actors, a new health infrastructure was built from scratch. Digitization was accelerated in business, education, and a little bit in public administration. After all, many tasks could be completely from home, reducing traffic and exposure. Moving fast also meant that many mistakes were made and many of them were corrected. But what stands out to me is that as a whole we managed to cope with the shock with empathy, with creativity and public support. I see no reason why we can't face the challenges of the climate crisis when we work together as we did now. Secondly, Corona hit our society and economy in an unequal way. Many white-collar workers could retreat to their safe and spacious places and carry on from home. At the same time, cashiers and delivery staff took greater risks to help to keep us well fed and supplied all the time. In the midst of the pandemic, Berlin's tech companies had rising revenues and startups collected record sums of VCs. Yet much of the soul of Berlin, like the event industry, clubs and tourist attractions, still lack a clear perspective for a return to a normal business. And we don't know yet, to be honest, how much of that change is structural, what is irreparable. As a state, we put in place generous programs to avoid layoffs, cover companies' fixed costs, and support investments in hygiene measures and digitization. Those programs have worked. The climate crisis also implies an unequal burden. Risks and the need for adaptation will be different across different regions. What has happened with the flood in the West can hardly happen in Berlin. Here we will have to fight to keep our city cool and well supplied with drinking water the next years. Similarly, as for the health crisis, we'll have services and industries that can quickly switch their focus or already bet on the right products. Others will require support to develop a carbon-neutral business model and reinvent themselves. COVID-19 forced us to be decisive and to expand instruments to support individuals, businesses, and associations. Those structures have proved to be highly effective, and they are there to stay to face the climate crisis. With this institutional toolkit at hand, we can and need to act boldly to leave no one behind in the climate crisis. Thirdly, our investments in innovative sectors and the transformation of our economy paid off. The Berlin startup ecosystem continued to flourish despite of the crisis, attracting more than 4 billion euro in investments this year. At the same time, our regional health cluster contributes to the solutions for the COVID-19 pandemic with safe vaccination and so on. In our Zukunftsorte, places for the future, we have established locations across the city where business, research, education, and civil society come together to solve the problems of today and tomorrow. As I said in the beginning, rethinking such abundant spaces, like this one maybe, is in our DNA. The latest two such places will be Siemensstadt 2.0 and the Urban Tech Republic on the former TXL airport. They will combine work on renewable energies, mobility with housing developments in line with high environmental standards. Thanks to our aid packages and our new backbone of innovative industries, Berlin has fared much better than Germany as a whole. Berlin's GDP fell only by 3% last year as compared to around 5% nationally. I'm therefore convinced that we are on track when we focus on high tech and green growth. This will help us put the health crisis behind us and tackle the much bigger climate crisis. We have multiple programs in place to reshape our city according to this approach. Our master plan Solar City seeks to accelerate solar expansion in Berlin in order to produce 25% of the electricity demand from solar energy by 2050. We fund batteries to store that energy, and we have just passed a law to render solar panels mandatory for new buildings and roofs. Since the summer, we have also expanded subsidies to improve the energy efficiency of buildings and drive down emissions. During the COVID crisis, we extended our benefit for businesses shifting to electric vehicles. Our local transport company, the BVG, or BVG, will has almost 140 electric buses in service and will switch to electric buses only by 2030. All of those measures are just a starting point. We need to think bigger. This will be the task for the next government, federal government, and here in Berlin by the end of the year. While it is hard to see the chance in the COVID-19 crisis, the opportunities of the transition to zero carbon are very real. By rethinking urban industry and innovative technologies, we can create green growth and create new jobs in the region. This will not only benefit engineers and accountants, but also the local trades and services. The strategic investments of today will turn into the tax revenues and jobs of tomorrow. Only this way we can grow out of the COVID-19 debt and face the climate emergency at a time. I'm convinced that this is the way to go, and that it will make the sun, and that it will make our cities, more livable places for the next years, and this is where people will want to live and to work in the cities. Now, I very much look forward to hearing your views on the special dimension of the crisis and the recovery. Have a nice evening. Nice to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have a little pause until the box is gone, and I would like to ask everyone is going to join me on the panel tonight to come to the front and onto the stage, please. As Ramona Popp said before, the quarantine economies was basically our starting point in a way, as well for this panel. We set up the moratorium together with Charlotte Malter-Barth, who is on the other side of the panel, and leading the moderation tonight with me to discuss or to open up a thinking space, first of all. We saw, or we still see, the pandemic as a moment of pause. This pause proved the idea of Alternativlosigkeit, a term that Chancellor Angela Merkel coined, wrong. Human paradigm and cultural values and behaviors, as we all know now after the pandemic, or maybe after the pandemic, are not a given, but inscribed in the social, economic, and legal frameworks, the structures of our everyday lives. And this is what we're thinking about and what we're questioning. How can we find and implement new policies? That's where the title Seeking Policies comes from, for a common and better future of global metropolis. And today we are here at this very special site that is connected a lot as well with policies. We are here at a former GDR production site, and you can see it's not anymore, it's only remnants. It's leftovers that couldn't be teared down because it was simply too expensive to tear these towers down. So we moved in, and together with Christopher Roth, Nikolai von Rosen, and Gregor Dietz, that are owners of the other part, we are now developing the site and thinking about what is possible. What are the options for industrial sites like this? So that's the context. And I know that a lot of people already asked about this green books that you can see that you maybe already had in your hands. There will not be a tour today. We had a tour in the very morning to discuss some points because we are ourselves discovering the place at the moment. You can find basic information in here, and we are working on a digital guide. So you're very welcome to discover not only our site, but the whole area, the Herzberg Areal. And yeah, this book will help you. And very soon, hopefully, our digital guide will help you with this as well. And now I would like to hand over to Charlotte, who will give you a bit more of an insight into the moratorium. She did that yesterday already as a speaker on the panel and will introduce the topic a bit more in detail, and then we'll hand over to our guests tonight.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for attending this today, and also for our guest for accepting to jump with us in this initiative. The moratorium is an initiative that was started in April I personally work on resource extraction in my own pedagogies and in my research, and somehow after the pandemic in March 2020, there was this text by Bruno Latour who was asking about the idea of pause and how we should use basically the fact that the system has proven to be possible to just stop, and how we should use that chance to basically rethink our systems. And as I explained yesterday already, the only thing that didn't stop was always the construction sites. I mean, there are places where they stopped temporarily, there are places where there was some adjustment, but generally it seems like construction was suspended from all these measures that were put in place. And somehow I think that was very telling on the fact that we are addicted to that growth culture, and that we actually don't know how to do that differently. So the moratorium emerged as a kind of tool to discuss this question. And today we are discussing, so it's the fourth roundtable. There were already 3 other roundtables, and this one is called Seeking Policy, because it emerged very clearly that if we were to stop building, and then we could discuss who is to stop building, what is not to be built, and for how long, this is something that can only be done with policy. And so there is this question of how we can mobilize the law that is very often, if you think about zones of exception, for instance, where tax are suspended or some standards of safety are also not being put in place because there is a kind of exceptional economic zone, you could actually revert that, and you could think there will be other zones where it's possible to do things in a different way. So that was just an example to say that the law is something that should also be harnessed for the common good as a space regulator, and thinking about also the powers and the limitations of the law. So I will not talk too long about this, just to say that there are precedents of moratoriums. They exist. They are the ones that were implemented in the Baleares or in the Costa Brava, where basically governments decided to stop handing over building permits for a certain time. There are also places like Barcelona which stop handing permits for hotels. And we, of course, know of more politically sensitive moratoriums, such as the one that is, let's say, supposed to be happening on settlement construction in Israel, for instance, which remains a hotly debated topic. So just to say that moratoriums are an existing tool, a political tool as well, and maybe a sensitive one at times. And that we are also excited to discuss with our guests their views. And I hand back to Angelica for telling a little bit more about what we asked from our guests.
We will hear tonight short statements. That was the task. We gave everyone the topic and asked, what have we not learned from the global crises regarding urban policy making? What would you see as the next necessary steps of action? And what are the core aspects, or what is the root problem to be considered in the discussion? Quite hard questions, of course, and we hope, or I hope, I already know, some point of views. So I'm very much looking forward to your short statements. I will actually right away start with our statements. The first speaker I would like to introduce is Saskia Hebert, co-founder of Subsolar Architektur und Stadtforschung.
Bis 2% gehören und Tausende uns hörig sind.
Okay.
Meint ihr nicht, wir könnten uns in Äther braten lassen und bis zum letzten Tropfen dem Verpackungshandel fronen? Wir könnten, aber... Meint ihr nicht, wir könnten unsere Züge zigtausendfach in falschen Farben...
Okay, we didn't rehearse that, obviously. Yeah, do you? No, I just start now.
Maybe you can introduce
Yeah.
Saskia before
Properly.
she can say her statement. There was a
But
hiccup.
actually, it's important that I continue now.
Yeah.
Okay then.
So we have to work it out somehow. No, it's just I brought you these voices from the past because I think they fit very well to what we're doing here. It was the beginning of a song called Prologue by the band Einstürzende Neubauten that you maybe know. It is the first song on their 1989 album Haus der Lüge, House of Lies. Because in that year, on the 21st of December, the band crossed the still existing inner German border to give a very unlikely concert here on this side at the Kulturhaus of VEB Elektrokohle. Back then, a bit like today, the situation was unstable. The severe crisis of the political system was obvious, but it was totally unclear what changes would follow. Not knowing what the future would bring, people were somehow muddling through. They had become part of the ongoing transformation just by being there at that time. 1 year later, the Einheitsvertrag was signed, the wall disappeared, and 17 million of GDR citizens had moved to another country without leaving their homes. But in contrast to today's crises, in late 1989, optimism prevailed. Surprised of what they already had achieved, most people were looking forward to the changes, not yet fully realizing maybe how or that they might come with a price tag, which we now know, looking backwards, we know shortly after the reunification, not only recently finished Neubauten collapsed, but whole industries, like this one here. Careers ended and the ruins of the rundown system were sold out faster than you could think. But when I come back to what we just heard, the text, if you don't understand any German, does not really make sense, but it's open for interpretation. I like the sentence, dem Verpackungshandel fronen, for example, which means something like drudging for the packaging trade. Could be read maybe as a comment to the contemporary habits of constantly ordering parcels online, using the planet as a great landfill for the stuff we no longer need. And also the suggestion to sign up for 1 or 2% of ownership to subordinate thousands of others could be understood as an accusation or critique towards the 1 or 2% of very rich people who profit from the exploitation of poorer ones, or the 1 or 2 global regions that are responsible for the 1 or 2 degrees of global warming that now threaten everyone, anywhere. I think even the rhetorical figure used in the song resonates with our current situation. The phrase, meint ihr nicht, don't you think, creates a big we, suggesting a companionship or even complicity, which is followed by the answer, wir könnten, we could, but then, noise. When I entered the field or rather at that time the niche of eco-social transformation through the door of design, by the way, I experienced something similar. Meint ihr nicht, don't you think, some activists and scientists asked, we could actually do something to stop greenhouse gas emissions, to save biodiversity, to reduce consumption and to get in balance with the one planet we have? Perhaps we could, a few people answered, but then, noise. The public interest in these questions grew significantly when thousands of young people started to protest publicly. Meint ihr nicht, don't you think? They asked every Friday. We could share our wealth, our commons, our resources and resilience with those who live elsewhere or are born later. We probably could, some more people nodded, and then noise. After that phase, a virus entered the stage, forcing people to change routines very quickly. At first, that caused a lot of insecurity, but then also sparked new hope. Meint ihr nicht, don't you think, people asked, that we could actually learn not to travel so much, to take better care of each other, and to value what is really important in life, for example, life itself? Now even more people and some politicians said we possibly could, but then noise again. So today, we, architects, mayors, other people whose business it is to design alternative futures, meet here in these ruins. And if I would ask you, the audience, meint ihr nicht, couldn't we don't you think we could not build new buildings, not exploit distant resources, not generate money by speculating with the very soil we are standing on? What would you answer? Wir könnten, we could, and then silence maybe? The point I want to make, and I'm done in a minute, is that inventing futures, giving or having new hopes and to make fantastic plans is all very well, but just not enough. We have to go past and beyond the noise. We have to say not only we could, but also we will, or equally important, we prefer not to. That's, in a way, the answer to all of your three questions, I think. Design, understood as transformation design, can not only change the shape of objects or buildings, but also the shape of stories, dreams, communities, and many other things. In that sense, we are all transformation designers maybe and should contribute our share to opening, building, and preserving possible or better preferable futures. And maybe to encourage and initiate unlikely encounters, strange coalescences, and improbable concerts would be a good start. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saskia. You basically introduced yourself. You're working in transformation design mainly. You have your office together with Matthias Lohmann, Solar, who is here as well. You received your PhD in 2012 on the phenomenon of lived space, and I have to add you worked on Lichtenberg as well. We did the tour today and tomorrow together, and it was very great to have you. So maybe we come back to that topic later on as well. You're doing a lot of different things, interdisciplinary and participatory formats at the interface of research, teaching, and practice in urban development. Thank you. So I'll hand over to Charlotte again.
Thank you, Saskia, for this inspiring talk. We'll get back to it. I'm going to introduce our next speakers, which are Tobias Hönig and Adriana Ivanda, co-founders of CoNow, a Berlin architectural practice taking care of imagining and realizing objects, architecture, and urbanity, perhaps realizing what Saskia is asking, as well as, of course, editorial and discursive revision of related issue. CoNow is Adriana Ivanda, Dui Antran, Tobias Hönig, Markus Rampel, and Paul Reinhardt, and all contributors who collaborate in accomplishing a task, those who give assignments, those who advise, craftspeople, and workers. CoNow was and is involved in teaching at various institutions and teaching formats, including technical universities in Berlin and Munich, the Academy of Fine Arts in Nuremberg, the Dessau Institute, and the University of Stuttgart. Starting in the coming winter, they will hold a guest professorship at the University of the Arts and Design in Linz. We are now asking about your statements, or let's say answers to the question that Angelika had formulated.
Okay, so the thing is, we prepared kind of a pamphlet for today, quite a lot of stuff, and the good news for you is that we won't read it. The bad news for us is that we have to summarize it now. And I've tried to keep it short, but I mean, we were invited somehow with the question to speak for a younger generation of architects, which is already like a interesting term that we could debate for a long time. And maybe we try to shift from that, because where you mentioned all this teaching stuff and working with people that are way younger than we experienced in the last 2 or 3 years that there's a certain political awareness under young people, which is not comparable to what we were like at the age of 21, 22, 23. They ask the right questions, and they come with interesting examples, and they ask for more. So you cannot even feed them with enough best practice examples or historical examples to fulfill the energy that they bring onto the table. That's the first point. And another point is that we made where we are here at this very specific site, this old GDR factory, and we had this tour this morning that was already mentioned, where we came upon other traces of that time. And this is just an example where this reminders came in, but big part in the discussion that we also had in between today all of the time is that we are all very aware of the tasks that are in front of us, and that we probably are not able to feed the students with enough best practice examples, but we know historical examples, and we would probably know how to start tomorrow. Starting can also mean not to start building again, but creating other spaces. We always call this spaces spaces of negotiation, which will become, under a certain point, also spaces of action. And one striking thing that we just recently learned in talking to people who were involved in the planning offices at GDR, for example, was that they, at the end of the 70s and 80s, already had something which was cybernetic planning for recycling and urban mining in their cities. I mean, we can debate about how they got all the information to not guess and speculate about gray energy. They knew every tank full of every truck that was involved in doing that. That is probably a system question. But based on this, they decided how to go on with their town planning. And they decided what is reasonable to keep, where do we need something added, and how can we get our resources back of what's already built and use it a second time in another way. And I mean, this just underlines a little bit that probably the solutions are already on the horizon, and we need to start doing that. This is the other point, and probably, I mean, I could longly talk about the windmills of bureaucracy, administration that we have to fight with every day, and that also probably are a problem for these young generations that I mentioned. I mean, to keep it short and to come to an end, we agree with the point that this Alternativlosigkeit, which is kind of a gender now, is really not a border that can't be crossed. And by all this writing that we did, we have like 2 quotes that we probably want to throw out in the end, provocative. Maybe you want to read it? So I do Margaret Thatcher. There's no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families. And no government can do anything except through people. And people must look after themselves first. And now Boris Johnson.
We are going to do it. We are going to do it together. One thing I think the coronavirus crisis has already proved is that there really is such a thing as a society.
That's it.
Thank you for your statement and adjusting, and I think you brought a few points that we will discuss again later.
We will go on with Manuel, that is next beside me. Manuel is head of sustainable properties at the Triodos Bank, where he's working since 2016. He's specialized in sustainable construction. And the Triodos Bank as a bank is a sustainable bank which pursues the idea of using its customers' money to finance positive change in society in regard to the environment, social affairs, culture, and sustainable buildings, with focus on post-growth, common good, non-speculative and democratic society of positive urban development. Manuel, I'm very excited about your statement.
Wow, where did you get that from? Yeah, thanks for having me. I guess as a representative of a financial institution, I am representing the money that is used everywhere to build or not to build. And in our case, as a sustainable financial institution, we have a long list of exclusion criteria, and projects that are not in line with our exclusion criteria cannot be financed. So what we actually do is not financing. And if we do, and if we do, it has to be in line with climate goals. It has to be in line with a society that that is livable and appreciable for everyone. So it's, and yeah, that's the one point. And the other point is, I think, that I'm representing the sector of financing buildings and buildings as something that is using steel and concrete, one of the most toxic things that you can do for or against the environment. I brought a couple of figures with me, underlining why we are actually not financing as a financial institution, which is contradictory. But if a new building is built, then if it's done quite efficiently in steel and concrete, it uses at least 1 ton of CO2 already for the building material, and that is the equivalent to driving a medium-sized car for 10,000 kilometers straight. That is just building 1 square meter of, for instance, residential apartments. So if you take an 80 square meter apartment, it would equivalent to circling the Earth 20 times with a petrol engine car, which would take 1 year if you travel with 100 kilometers an hour, just to build 1 apartment. And then regarding the fact that we are actually building already way too much, just in terms of residential apartments. The net growth in Germany of population last year was 220,000 inhabitants. That would proportionally require new apartments or newly built apartment units of about, I wrote the number down, 115,000 statistically needed. Actually, we finished or completed 306,000 apartments, so almost 3 times as much as statistically we would have needed. This causes for an additional land soil sealing each year, which equivalents approximately the size of the city of Bonn, our former capital, resulting in the loss of biodiversity. And we all, and Romana Popp said it earlier, we actually need that to cool down our cities. So we're building more than we need to. We still have rising prices and critical cities, and this for me is something that states that the market alone does not solve the problem of, for instance, housing crisis or problems. In addition to the fact that the way we do build is highly toxic for the environment and not compliant with climate goals. So I'm very glad that we are in a location where we can see that we can also establish livable and vivid places without building something, using what is already there. And for the future, I want to say that we do not know and cannot anticipate what we actually need in 20 or 30 or 40 years, and everything we build is so precious that we need those materials to be to maintain in the circle, in the life cycle. But what we do right now is demolishing it and downcycling everything we have, and this has to stop. And in addition, I would say we already have to look at things that are built and that are shaping our society in a built environment that we probably and hopefully do not need anymore in the close future, and that is something like shopping centers, gas stations, car parks, or retail spaces with car parks in front of them, and we have to cope with that. But we also have to learn that these are developments that do not have, well, this is a sort of history that cannot happen again, because the materials are just so precious, and the climate goals cannot be met if we continue to build what we and how we build today. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel, for your statements. I turn to Sabine Oberhuber. She's an economist, architectural consultant, and one of the early pioneers of the circular economy. She's the co-founder of Turn2, a Dutch service company focused on achieving a circular economy. She developed some of the first business models and circulatory strategies and contributed to shaping the thinking around the circular economy transition. And together with Thomas Rauch, she published the book Material Matters, where they present their vision of a circular economic system. And those of you who were lucky enough to see her presentation yesterday and our micro debate. Please, Sabine, tell us about your own vision and statements for this round of questions.
Yes, I really love the question you asked. So what have or have we not learned from the global crisis? And what I understood, what didn't we not have learned from the last financial global crisis? And I think that was that I was missing the politics taking back primacy. So you have in German this beautiful word, Primat der Politik. And I think this is exactly what we need at this moment. We need leadership. And at the time, and I think this is also still happening, politics is giving out money without really demanding to the societal agenda and serving the societal agenda. And I think that is something which we just simply cannot longer afford, having politicians which just are driven by lobbyists and by short-term, also personal interest of maybe shaping the next few incentives to create a little bit of work, instead of really thinking ahead a couple of decades what really does this system need in terms of new industrial policies, in terms of building policies. And I think there are so many urgent topics we need to address that I really am shocked how the political leadership at the moment is not really addressing these questions in a really fundamental way. And I think if you look at what it means for constructions, we have to very, very quickly address this driver for continuous growth also in the built environment, because the problem is the companies which are building, they are also subject of this imperative for continuous growth. So construction companies need to realize, and foremost investment companies in construction need to grow. And I was really, today I found a photograph I would love to share it with you around the Potsdamer Platz. What it says is, feel the pulse of progress. And it is an ad for Berlin's next great shopping destination. So I think in the 2021, having such a statement is just a shocking one. And we really need to understand that this definitely is not longer progress. And progress is something which evolves about well-being and welfare of people. And we really need to understand that it's not economic growth we need, but it's a completely different paradigm of how we shape the economy.
Sabine, thank you very much for your very important statement, bringing us back to the very core topic, economy, and like the parameters that are the base of the discussion we're having here tonight as well. Now I'm handing over to our last panel guest, last but not least, Dean Simpson, a professor of architecture, urbanism, and urban planning at the Royal Danish Academy of Fine Arts. He is an architect and urbanist, teaching architecture, urbanism, and urban planning. And he leads the program, master's program of urbanism and societal change at the KDK. He's conducting research on contemporary urban and architectural conditions with a focus on socio-spatial transformation at the intersection of demographic change and processes of modernization, globalization, neoliberalization, and welfare state transformation, as well as critical examination of contemporary sustainability discourses. I think that's a perfect fit after Sabine.
Okay, that's a mouthful. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here in this amazing and extraordinary space here. I would just start, and I'm going to offer some quite straightforward and simple statements, but to support, let's say, to declare my support for the moratorium as a provocation. For me, I think that what it does is potentially open up a space for important and urgent debate that allows us to critically question these systemic machineries of speculative, extractive urban development that we see playing out in our cities and globally, which in their current form, let's say at the intersection of a near future, which meets business as usual with so-called green growth, points towards some form of common or collective disaster that we face. From my perspective, this moratorium is not a call for a kind of freezing of the city as a kind of museum space, but rather allows us to ask deeper and more expanded questions. How can we value the riches of the existing in new ways? What impact do new buildings really have? How can we justify new buildings? Who has the right to build? And to ask this also at a planetary scale opens up questions of fundamental importance, let's say around these questions of the difficulties of climate justice at a global scale, what that means around projects towards global urbanization. And my entry to this discussion, apart from this long list that was embarrassingly read out, is a discussion, let's say, in relation to research which looks at how projects and urban development impacts, let's say, climatic questions in urban development, but also how urban development relates to our understandings of well-being, welfare through the last, let's say, half century of transformations. And in that sense, a project that I think resonates with that is a project that's led by a colleague of mine, Simon Sjoquist, and Kobe, along with other collaborators, which is trying to elaborate and build upon discourses around circular economy, life cycle analysis, urban mining, adaptive reuse, and so forth, with a starting point that the most sustainable building, of course, is the one that already exists. And in this sense, the project is very practical in its early stages as it emerges and develops in asking how the calculus determining how our buildings, landscapes, and infrastructures operates and informs how the decisions are made around if they are reused or demolished. And that calculus, of course, is impacted by a range of factors, and many local ones, many to do with how the new intention for this space or quarter or building overlays with those existing conditions and qualities. But in this case, I'm interested in particular how one of the very large factors in that discussion is the developer's business case and the spreadsheet, let's say, operating behind the decisions to be made. And in many cases, the fact that this spreadsheet does not take into account, in most cases, the embedded carbon or the understanding of how greenhouse gases are implied between understanding the advantages of keeping an existing structure and the expanded argument for preservation beyond a cultural heritage argument into the idea of how this could be compared to the impact of new structures. And thus, for me, I'm extremely interested in the work that Charlotte and Angelica are presenting, which is asking the question, how do we understand the impact beyond a classical life cycle analysis into the extractive system at a global level? In this sense, the project proposes how we might develop a pilot tool or an instrument that might approximate the climate impact of demolition versus new building at a larger urban scale at a time early in the process of larger developments when decisions are made over what should be kept, what is the nature of this urban fabric, how should we approach that system within the first kind of modelings of this spreadsheet. And in that sense, I think that the implication of this is how to introduce the common cost that carbon and greenhouse gases operate and produce within urban policy through planning regulation. And that's my comment earlier about the intention to make a very simple proposal as a provocation. And this question, which I think is really valid about the pandemic, what have we learned? My argument would be that one thing that we have relearned is the necessity and the potential of policy and good governance. And in this context, as Latour argues, as Charlotte points to, has in recent periods challenged the dominance of market-based economic orders with placing shifted and renewed focus on health, social equity, prioritization of the common good, the capacity also for, in this case, good governance to operate quickly within this kind of very testing time. And in that sense, the argument that we should see the city and our approach to policy as something extraordinarily malleable. And that perhaps this is the gift that we have been given in this past period of a kind of new open form of malleability, which might be deployed, as we've been discussing, on other terms, let's say in relation to climate, ecology, environment. And in that sense, in terms of the question what to do next, this might be about the notion that the local level could perhaps be the place to start, where individual cities, but also a discussion of cities in the context of entities such as C40 and ambitions to work toward a Green New Deal. And in that context, we can talk about the local in relation to the notion of planning and the history of planning with its vast toolbox of planning instruments, which have been designed in many ways to overcome prisoners' dilemmas and regulate the interests of the collective over the interests of the individual. From zoning ordinances that try to maximize daylight, to those that preserve landscapes, to those that control rents. The call here would be for a municipal applied tax for greenhouse gas impacts charged toward the calculus for development as one of many tools that we are hearing about today. And in that sense, I think that this would be one, let's say, question that we would ask: how would that be possible in the context of the flexibility and malleability we see at the level of local policy? Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you all for this wonderful round of statement and also position. And I will turn to Saskia and Sabine with a question, which I think maybe we start with Sabine. And I think that when you were throwing politicians under the bus, you were doing us a favor as to understand what are the points of leverage in the system, let's say in the built environment. So what are really the effective moments where we could apply pressure towards pivoting in, let's say, building regulations, but more generally, you talked about incentives versus, punishments, perhaps. And so I would basically ask, what is the potential of policy, and where would you see, very practical points of leverage in terms of, working towards change, let's say. So first, perhaps Sabine, and then I think Saskia could follow up.
I think, is this micro? Yeah, now it's working. I think building regulations as such are an extremely important point. When I talk to large investors, large construction companies, they tend to say, we could build differently, but we're just not doing it because we can afford not to do so. Because in this current environment, companies are demanded by their shareholders to maximize their profits. And as long as they can afford to build more cheaply by not adhering to climate standards, they will do so, because it's just in their own interest. So that is one thing. Secondly, for me, it is just obscene that we allow companies, development companies, to go away with profit margins which are 30, 50%, and at the same time have something like a discussion of Mietpreisdeckelung in Berlin, while we let these companies go away with profits of millions, which is, I think, is just obscene. So that is something, I think, a debate we have to have. And I think also the question of what should we be building. So this example I just showed, and I am very much on the same page with Manuel, sorry. That's building more shopping malls, building more stuff we just don't need is something we should be stopping. And I think there really a political vision of what a city is to be and how we shape our public space in order to serve its citizens and not speculative investors is something we have to address very, very quickly. And I think then also the question of livable cities and climate resilient cities would come together.
Thanks. Saskia, would you like to pick up?
Yeah, maybe I can pick up with the question, who is the client? Because I think that we often forget that, or it's a dilemma since the beginning of time, that the architect builds for an investor or for someone who pays her the money to do something, and the people living in that building maybe are not the same, like the people who are the contractors. And I think if we ask whom do we build for and what does it actually cost others, we would kind of shift the scale or add some lines to your spreadsheet, so we could ask questions differently. Because I'm quite annoyed if people just ask like, yeah, but what would that cost if we do all this climate change things? And I always ask them, yeah, what does it cost if we don't? And whom does it cost? So I think this kind of commodification in the debate, probably we can first shift it to other points, to other values, and then maybe we could even get rid of it, because I would really like that.
I would love to add to your point, because one of the things is also that buildings, certainly buildings which are sort of speculative built buildings, are for the people who are building them just a very, very short time investment. So you have this sort of, we call it split incentive of driving down the construction costs and making everything as cheap as possible, while the follow-on costs are for the next party who's taking on that investment, and which are very often pension funds, etc. So it's society which is paying for the badly made buildings. And that is also something we could change via regulation. So we are sort of proposing that if you want to invest in a building, then you have the responsibility for, let's say, 30 years.
I like Dean's point that we would actually take a first step in order to create a change in the, for instance, building material by putting a price tag on it, because that's something that we already know. And if we put a price tag of, say, 180 euros per ton CO2, which is suggested by Scientists for Future, for instance, on the building material, it would double the cost of a steel and concrete building just for core and shell. Double the cost. So that would lead already to a shift in building material and the way we plan, and that could be definitely a first step.
I would like to add on to this thinking models that are very much inscribed, the ideas of profit and more is more. That is as well part of the works of architects in a way, because the honorary system we're working under as architects is based on more is more as well. Saskia, we talked about that when we had our pre-talk. I would like to hand over this question to you, and as well maybe to you, Manuel. What do you think are new business models for architects that can overcome this idea of building more? Where do you see potential to kind of like either work around or like find new ways of working away from building more to just make money?
Yeah, I would say in general, I think we are thinking a lot about it to really like rethink the architectural profession on its own. So I think for the future, it will not only be about building, but it will be like really about taking agency for the urban. And I think also in this point, it's I think it was in all of your statements that it's really necessary to have the politics which support and finance like young architects for the job.
Maybe to give an example, I mean, out of the very rich history of the city, and just yesterday we were invited to an event on the Internationale Bauausstellung in the 80s, and it was divided, Überalt and Überneu. And there is this wonderful movie that's circulating in Berlin by Pina Ögenci, a Turkish architect and filmmaker, who portrayed the female architects that worked in Kreuzberg in the 80s on the topic of urban renewal. They were paid by the commune, by the land of Berlin, okay, West Berlin. I'm not familiar with the exact legal status at that time, but their work was so far beyond the classical approach of architecture. They, for the first time, made Turkish, Kurdish communities seeable in a way, and they gave them a voice, and they teach them what rights they have, and they teach them how to work with this housing structures that haven't been renovated or touched for 40 or 50 years at the same time with an ecological approach. But, I mean, we talked about it today, and you said, okay, that was a complete other state and a complete other country. And, yeah, I mean, we can ask the question, where do we have that today? I mean, who pays groups of architects, sociologists, social pedagogues to go out to a part of the town and to think with the people who actually live in that buildings, how can we go on with this urban structure? And in this way, I think the profession has to shift, but therefore we need a lot of support.
A slightly different approach to that, but your question was, how do we enable planners and architects not to foster a system of growth or adding volume so it adds to their salary, basically. And that might be, I mean, I have two ideas in mind. One idea could be that in order to get a building permit, the architect needs to calculate what is actually the gray backpack of CO2 of a building. And municipality has to determine what is the maximum of CO2, for instance, per square meter that is embodied in the building. And if it's too much, you don't get a building permit. So the architect is incentivized to, or actually needs to plan in a way that a certain benchmark is not, or is reached as of CO2 in the mass in the building already. And we are looking too much on the operation of a building and not on the building itself. And the second approach will be the responsibility of an architect. I mean, if you plan something that is then falling apart again, then you're made responsible for that, for a planning mistake, for instance. But you're not made responsible for something that has to that is, for instance, the toxic waste of the future. If you plan something that is really not recyclable. But that could change already, or again also the responsibility for the building materials that are planned in a system in a circular way. So that is actually that responsibility does not stop with the sale of a building or with the end of the planning or with a building permit, for instance.
That probably something that should be a shared responsibility, I guess. At one point, the kind of we talked about the responsibility of the developer, the responsibility of the city and of the architect. I guess that one could look at that as a kind of shared burden towards sustainability, real sustainability. I mean, not the one with the brackets. And I mean, I just want to give an example because yesterday we had, as a wonderful speaker, we had Liz Diller, and there is this story of the High Line and of the first phase of the High Line where the office used for the benches teak wood, which was actually forbidden to use because it was, extracted in the Brazilian Amazon and was actually, not even allowed, I think. And they used it, and then an association of citizens realized that they were using that wood and made a campaign and so on and so forth. For the second phase, they used for the woods, for the benches, they used former boardwalks that were damaged during Sandy, the hurricane, and so they used, second-hand wood. And there, I think it's a very interesting example because you could say, why not in the first place? Right? And that is the part where the responsibility of the architect is engaged, and it's also not to, kind of look at their work with 15 years and say, well, you could have done that. But I think it's also about a shift in understanding design. And I think that maybe we could turn to Dean also and ask about these questions. I mean, you work a lot with the welfare state. So is there a threshold where these responsibilities that the welfare state is, kind of supposed to be undertaking and the architect's responsibility that could be designed through policy, for instance? I mean, it's maybe nebulous as a question, but are there moments where this responsibility could be harnessed and, let's say, constructed together so that the responsibilities are shared, basically?
That's a tricky question. I think, for me, what's interesting about this moment in relation to those kind of questions is a changing landscape of ethics within the role, let's say, of architects, urban planners, around how we understand the set of values and, let's say, frameworks within which we are striving to achieve. And that has something also to do with, let's say, how we are increasingly forced to kind of shift in our imaginaries of futures, of what we see in terms of what are the qualities that exist and so forth. And I think if we draw this kind of parallel to the idea of the role of the architect in the kind of formation of the so-called post-war welfare state, there was, let's say, kind of declared and also undeclared framework of understanding a certain kind of solidarity and a certain kind of responsibility to a kind of wide common good. And I think, of course, this narrative of, let's say, from late 80s onwards of a kind of shift, let's say, in the client of the architect and also in the logic of ethics and in terms of the commissions and the structures, in terms of also the development toward a condition in which urban development is seen as an economic driver rather than a kind of social driver. So I think that this question right now, which I think is super interesting, is how can we structure and develop and refine a new form of ethics for our built practice?
I mean, we talked in another roundtable, we had a discussion about practice, right? And I will turn to Andriana with that question because, I mean, it relates. In a way, is it possible for the architectural practice to actually reinvent itself while we know it is itself ingrained in extractive practice, right? The office is kind of very hierarchical, at times super exploitative. There's a culture of terror. I'm not talking about your office, of course, but we all know, and we all have been. I'm just talking in generally, but we all have been in situations where you probably intrinsically know it's not okay what's going on, but you go on with it because the culture of design has that kind of let's say, suffering attached to it. And so I'm kind of suspicious whether all these changes that we're talking about are even possible without a certain shift within the office itself. So we were talking about starting locally. I guess we could also start at home. So, and I know we're talking about seeking policy, but I wonder if there is not a link between the capacity of an office to reinvent itself and its capacity to actually ask for change at higher levels. I think that this might, those scales might actually be more connected than one suspects. So I would like to turn to you and ask perhaps what's your view? I mean, you were talking about the redefinition of what being an architect is, and how would that be translated within the office?
Yes, totally difficult. So this is, I think, because Tobias also said at the beginning, we are kind of a young office, and we are in the mid of our 30s, at the beginning of the 40s. And indeed, I kind of already feel pretty old as an office because we find ourselves in really harsh structures. We are really dependent on private investors for our building. So we started our office with the best intention to do social concerned architecture, but we ended like really fast, or we had to end like really fast to work for private people. And the other thing is that the people we are also working for are not even investors, but like also, I would say, with a lower income, they still do build their houses on their own, but they are, as I mentioned, no investors, and we have small projects. And this kind of makes it hard for us to really engage in the social and in the ecological part, because when you want to build like really ecological, it's too expensive for our clients most of the time. So we try to think and to invent like small changes we can do with the budgets we have, but it's not really possible most of the time. Maybe you want to add something?
Yeah, also, I mean, the interesting thing, because Angelika mentioned that before, that there's still like the more expensive the building gets, the higher is the income of the office in a way. I think that doesn't count for most of the smaller, freshly young established offices, as they are all working on a very small scale. And I mean, what's recognizable in the last years is that younger offices come with sort of a collective approach. And we were considered for a long time to be a collective, and this is still around, but we went over to the notion to say, no, we are not a collective, we are a limited company. And I think that's already the borderline. Like, how is a practice defined by law and by the rules of the market in the end, and what brings that for your everyday life? I mean, what does it mean to, as we do, share all the money which is on the table? It's not possible to talk to your tax accountant about this, because they say, no, that's not possible. She earned more than you earned. So these are kind of the borderlines there in a way. And I mean, when we talk about really like a shift of the profession in a way, then probably, as you already like pinpointed a little bit, then it's like really it must be another system or another profession in a way, because weirdly wise, all this hierarchical stuff is still reproduced, and you still have these moments of terror in a way. And by that, it's really, really difficult to transform this profession, because there's still the artist, architect, who does the one thing, he sketches it, and it's good, and it's art.
That's why I asked before as well about business models that would work for architects. And I find it super interesting that you answered in ways that are referring to other actors to do something so architects can work differently. And I think that's one of the problems of systemic questions very often, that responsibilities are just passed on to someone different. So I'm asking again, Dean, you mentioned vision building before. What vision do we need to create? We talked about that before during the walk as well. What does it need, and what points exactly do architects need? Where do they need to start to act, to really work on the system? as well maybe on like the question of policy and partaking in politics. I can pass that to everyone who wants
I
to
think
answer first.
Saskia wanted to pick up anyway, and then we could turn to Dean if that's okay.
I was just thinking that asking the architects how they should or would change their profession is a little bit mean. I mean, we witnessed that the car industry can't really get out of the car because they build cars. And what do you ask them as an alternative business model for? So this kind of being embedded in a system and having to cope with all its kind of logics is a very hard thing. And it's really, I thought maybe we should get help. Maybe the car people can help us to change our profession, and we can help them to get out of their stupid things that nobody would invent if we hadn't all the cars. And I think what is really important to realize is I meet that often in the transformation design field, that people who want to change things always have to declare why they want to change things. So they always have to explain. They have die Erklärungslast oder Erklärungsnot. And I think that's quite unfair. I think we should think more like what happens if we don't change. And I don't know, maybe the business model of an architect could be just to be paid for not doing anything. And by whom, I don't know. Maybe there's a overall budget for not building things.
But there's a precedent. For instance, I mean, I'm sure everyone is familiar with the project of Lacaton Vassal in Place Aucuc, where they themselves suggested to the municipality not to build, but instead to reinvest the money in maintenance protocols. So I think that there is the possibility for a profession to reinvent itself, especially when the profession is about design. I think that actually maybe it was meanly formulated, but I do believe that architects are able to kind of shift within their own mechanisms. But of course, the financial question remains, the kind of most crucial one. Dean, you perhaps wanted to pick up on Angelica's question before I interrupted.
Yeah, I think that we were discussing earlier this question around what is the role of vision, and let's say to talk about this question of the notion that we have to undergo and carry out quite large transformations about the way we live and the spaces we occupy, and how we build and so forth. And that a lot of that discussion is sort of structured around kind of quantitative framings of targets. It's framed around technological fixes. It's framed around some open-ended idea of something that will somehow solve the kind of missing gap in these targets. And I guess what I'm interested in that discussion about vision is not only for architects, but urbanists and those with stakes in the city is, let's say, the question of what are the qualitative implications of taking on that task. And how can we, let's say, steer that into a kind of space of extremely optimistic and generous qualities, rather than simply discussing qualities. And in that sense, I think that the creative disciplines have a huge role in, let's say, trying to propose new imaginaries for what that future might be. And at the moment, in the context of, let's say, how Fischer describes the end of the future, we need, let's say, positive and generous, but also nuanced and open-ended and resilient imaginations, imaginaries for these futures. And I think that architects, amongst many, many others, I think our role now is to be, let's say, putting those on the table, that we have qualitative things to actually discuss what the implications are of these radical targets that we are trying to meet. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. I mean, I think it's also being demanded, right? I think Andriana and Tobias were mentioning the kind of push from students. I mean, I can give another example, which I think is very telling. In one of the prominent universities in Europe, I will not name it, but there is a format which says that the diploma is already hand over. There is a topic and there is a site. And this year there was a kind of micro revolution. I mean, it was not a riot really, but like a small movement of students which demanded that in the project topic there would be not new buildings, that they would not be demanded as a diploma project to produce a new building, which I think is something that really talks about the urgency of addressing the kind of existing, and those new imaginaries, they're already kind of being, demanded urgently. So we're late to the party, actually. And I will turn to Sabine, because I think some of what you were mentioning, some of what you mentioned about, let's say, the kind of fundamental changes are also related to economical models. So perhaps it would be a good bridge to, if we're talking about these circular economies or non-building within this framework of policy making, but also financial models that seem to be somehow at the heart of the anxieties of the profession, I guess. Could you perhaps give us some insights in that direction?
Sorry, could you just make it more specific what you...
Well, your work as a kind of an economist has been to somehow almost reinvent an economical system. How would you see that, let's say, penetrating the construction industry also for architects, as you also have been, working as an architectural consultant? How would you see this becoming the mainstream, for instance? What would it take, I guess, my question?
I think for the architectural profession, it would take that architects understand much broader, in fact, the contextual boundaries of their profession. Because if you don't understand the business models, and if you, what we tend to do is, in our architectural profession, is also to, for example, what we did with one of our first buildings was to demand from all the suppliers to be able to take all their construction materials back. And that resulted in a completely different design, because also the suppliers had their say in how the design was made. So there is, and I think, as we already saw from many examples, architects have sort of the capacity to really think in a systemic way. I think that is also what is expected from the architectural profession, yet we very often see that it's reduced to the pure form and the outer shape of a building, rather than really understanding all the different implications of what building is for society, and what buildings need to do on the energy level, the climate level. I mean, the whole total cost of ownership of a building. These are all responsibilities of the architectural profession, but we have the impression that very often these are forgotten. It's just reduced to making a fancy, beautiful shape, which then ends up, hopefully, as an image in one of the magazines. Is that an answer to your question?
Yeah, but architects always say that the profession is always already so vast and so complex. So I'm, of course, I second the kind of need to understand all of the, what I call the political economy of space, meaning how is your building even existing? Who's paying for it? Where are the materials coming from? Who's going to build it? How much is the labor really costing? And not simply the shape of certain components. So I think that the shift that you're talking about is also about surrendering some sort of power, which I think is very difficult, because the profession is kind of, deeply into this kind of power position, where the master builder, to kind of paraphrase. But so handing power is not something easy, and usually it's something that is not done free-willingly. It has to be taken from you, and I think that a lot of architects already feel very disempowered. So I'm just wondering, at which moment can we make sure that the profession doesn't become irrelevant? I think that for me, that would be, it's kind of paradoxical, because it's a moratorium, a conversation on a moratorium on new construction, which is something that can feel very threatening to the profession, but it's actually exactly the opposite. It is about making sure that the architecture remains, or that architecture remains relevant, which means it absolutely needs to change to be able to continue on proceeding, let's say.
Maybe I
I-
can answer. Or
Yeah.
like, no.
I was just wanted to react to this giving power away. I think actually it is very empowering if you take the responsibility for the big context.
That on one hand, and adding on, I would say, like, things as well that you showed yesterday about taking care, maintaining buildings, open up, at least that's how I see it, new perspectives, how we can redevelop the practice itself. It might not seem architectural, but we can make it the practice in a way. And it's, Tobias schnauft laut. You're breathing. But I see a lot of potential, especially for younger architects that, maybe don't have or saw the office yet, to really explore new paths, because they need to be explored.
But I think, if I may add this, you can't only do buildings if you're an architect. I mean, you can, probably some of the most influential designs were never built. And I really like what Dean said about the imaginaries. Like, we are trained to design alternative situations. And this is quite singular. Most people can't imagine something different in a place like this than a factory. And this is our gift, and this is also our responsibility to change the way we perceive our environment. And we can contribute a lot here. And
Yes, and I think it is very important also to question the question you've got as an architect, because very often clients, out of this lack of imagination, give you a completely wrong question, and then you as an architect tend to give a wrong answer to a wrong question.
Tobias, you wanted to react?
Yeah, this was accidentally, to be honest. But I mean, when we talk about the profession of architecture and its self-understanding and the way it is taught, and I mean, there are so many things that are so clear, and I think all of them are outspoken. So, I mean, if Dean asks for a vision of the future, he's, for example, not asking for a nice image, but still, the universities are running on nice images, and students are trained to fulfill the level of a competition niveau. So you can do a floor plan, you can do a section and a nice image, and you will probably win a competition. And I mean, we have to start to also take this young generation serious, and this spaces of negotiation that we've been talking about, and this urban agency already happens there. And I think it's the starting point, because with the generation of architects, and it's more generations that are already in office now, it is a little bit of difficult. I mean, there are a lot of people doing great jobs and great stuff, but it's I mean, we don't want to talk about a reprogramming. I think that doesn't make sense. So it's also not fair to put the pressure on the young generation. I know that. But I think if we talk about do we build or do we not build, I would build on them.
I really liked your honest statements about your work and how it's dependent on the people that give you money. But I would like to highlight the spot or put it away from you a bit, because also the money, also the people that employ you need someone, a financial institution, for instance, to give them money. And there we come to a point that in the future, buildings, or I have to proceed in a different way. Today, buildings get their market value from the utilization. So a rent is earned with a property or a space, and the market value derives from that, not from the material, because the material is not of any value, because it cannot be made valuable. In the future, when we're looking at utilization of buildings that we cannot think of now, and maybe have a limit of material that actually can be used, the value of a property, and therefore the financing of your customer is dependent on the way you plan, so the material can actually be of value for your client. And that is the circle I want to highlight, because and that puts, I mean, that gives you in the end again the responsibility to plan in a certain way, but because your clients are dependent on the financing, and the financing will be in the future dependent on CO2 tax or prices that will be dependent on the utilization and hopefully dependent on the value of the material that is being used.
Yeah, that's, sorry. I mean,
That is being preserved at the end.
Right.
I mean, that's, I wanted to underline actually what you've been talking about before, that this has also a consequence on how you think construction in design already. If it is like you say, and I also think that it will be like this, then it makes sense to construct already in a way that you have in mind this circle, and that you have in mind, you've been talking about this before we were here on stage, but how can I construct a building so that I can easily deconstruct it and like immediately work with the material again? And that's like nothing where we need to reinvent our profession, because that's like a simple task. So that's a task on construction, and that's what we learn.
Yeah, design for disassembly is something that should be, you know, kind of a basic elective in school at that point, basically. Yeah, because that's what we're talking about. If we know that we cannot endlessly use materials which are valueless, apparently, but to a certain extent having a huge footprint, then we must always guarantee that these building materials will be finding a new life endlessly, possibly.
Yes, absolutely. And there also a policy comes in again. I know that Italy has, for some of their public constructions, are demanding design for disassembly. And in Holland, we have introduced this notion of a material passport. And we have founded the cadastre for material, the Madaster, which is also operational in Germany. But in Holland, probably from next year, material passports will be mandatory. So we will have to document what materials are being used in our built environment, so that we have a sort of, I also always call it sort of asset management of the materials which are in use and which we will be need to reuse in the future.
Yes, and there's another policy, for instance, I think Belgium has passed a policy that you can use materials for rebuilding, which is something that you cannot do in Switzerland. For instance, you're not allowed to use concrete to make new concrete, because it's considered to be statically unstable, even though, you know, probably we could invest a few billions in proving that it's the opposite. But I think this is kind of, I think, is a very promising direction. It speaks of how materials are being finally treated as something of value, in fact, or that we recognize that there are possibilities of second lives, and that architects are just getting the new task to design for disassembly, for instance, or to only build new things with old things, which is something that the Office Circular, which was also part of another roundtable, is doing. They have a database of all the materials that they can reuse so that they can build a new building, for instance, which is something that could be also fed into the technological tools that we use, you know, the CAD programs or BIM that is so smart but is not able to tell you that you could actually reuse another window instead of having a new one.
I have to admit I'm a little bit skeptical about this kind of commodifying the commodities that are used to construct commodities that can be then lived in. Because I think if we put a price tag to all the materials, or if we want to reuse them, that is better than now, clearly. But I prefer to think that we are borrowing all these things we build with from nature, basically. And I mean, even the term to use resources can be read critical on that term. Like we just take it and we claim it, and we say we have a plot of land and we say this is mine, and if you want to extract something, I sell it to you. And I mean, we don't do this with air yet. But I think we should stop like commodifying everything. It's like König Midas. It's like touching the everything gets gold, and in the end we starve.
Yes, but on the other hand, if we don't attach a value to it, you can trash it very easily. I mean, the way we deconstruct buildings at the moment is incredibly shocking if you think about it, and what we do with valuable materials within a split second is not something which we can afford in the future. And at the moment, our system, unfortunately, I'm with you on your page, sort of emotionally, but if we want to rebuild our system, I think there are some mechanisms which would help us to drive this circular construction by attaching a financial value to materials. Because if you, as an investor, don't write your building off to zero, you will write it off to the minimal material value, then there's a sort of incentive to maximize this value and to build it in a way, the building in a way that you can extract the materials at their highest possible value afterwards.
But maybe when we talk about destroying, I think also the notion of destroying, it's only possible when you own something. Like if you're not owning something, you're not allowed to destroy, or you can get in jail. And I think maybe this would help your theory kind of to think about material as not possessing it and having a value, and then you can resell it. But maybe it's of all of us, I don't know, like naively said.
Yeah. But you're right. The interesting thing is about the law of possession. There are a couple of there are 4 rights. It's the right to use something. But there is also the right to destroy something. So it's usus and abusus. And the thing in if you translate abusus into English, abuse, is something which absolutely is true. We should sort of eliminate from our property right.
I mean, I think we have touched upon a lot of topics, but maybe we could have a last round and then wrap up, because I think many topics have been, brushed. I'm happy that we could go a little bit more into detail than in previous conversations, but perhaps intrinsically this is the discussion about material preservation and how could this be made policy, right? I think that ultimately we're all talking about the same thing. So. Maybe we could just have a last round. So Sabine, you will be the last. I'm going to ask Manuel from his point of view as a person at the commands of this kind of capital distribution, and also the work with your bank somehow is already going in that direction. But how would you see this kind of material preservation becoming policy that would make this actually a mainstream thing possible? Or maybe more general thoughts about this question?
I mean, this is redundant because I already said that, but a price tag for CO2 would definitely help regarding building materials. And the idea of putting a benchmark to new buildings regarding gray backpacks or the CO2 backpacks would be a second one. Very practical thing that I think politics can pick up easily, and that would immediately change the way we think about planning. Yeah, I think I would leave it at that. Yeah.
But I'm not. You're not going to leave it at that. No, because I think that as your role in, kind of, I guess, making some decisions that have very big impacts wouldn't be something that you could initiate yourself. You were talking about how your company is already having this kind of sustainability goals and so on and so forth. So is this something that you would actually demand from now on? Like not you yourself, but you as a company who is handing over capital, if this is something that you could already, test run, for instance?
we are already doing that, but the downside of it is that there are a lot of other different financial institutions that are still doing it and are not excluding anything from their investment scope or financing scope. But for us, I can say that and I think that will be the standard in the future, and financial institutions will be limited towards their financial portfolio carbon-wise. So we will find each other again with more limitations, maybe from the financial side, and that are implications for architects then, coming from the financial side and regulation more than from the direct politics regarding the building law. But we are already aiming for a climate neutral credit portfolio, so that is something that is not achieved right now, but will be achieved in 2030. And that is something that once CO2 gets a price tag, every other financial institution will try to follow up with. And that can have, and then again, my introduction statement, that can really develop power.
Saskia, would you let us know your thoughts?
They kind of get mixed up in this kind of discussions, but I thought maybe maybe it's not rational, but I would like to put forward the idea that we don't. I mean, it's good to put a price tag on pollution that now just goes. I don't know. It's not paid for, or we all pay the price, and I think this is, of course, a very bad state we're in. But I prefer to think that all these materials we use, the cities we produce, are a commons. They belong to us all, and we should just kind of put a price tag on the benefit that we have from it, like Gemeinwohlökonomie, or like the profit we make, not money-wise, but society-wise. And then we would have another approach too. And maybe this could add up, or maybe we do this one first and then that one. But I think we have to go farther. We have to leave the system more and with more courage. Just like all this uncertainty, it should be good for something, I think.
Thank you. Dean?
I mean, as I mentioned, I think it's a range of different things. I think on the one level, it's what I mentioned about the engagement of a suite of, let's say, planning tools from the framework of a kind of municipal approach to regulating, and in that kind of different framework for expanding the kind of notion of planning as that directed from the good of the individual to controlling, let's say, outcomes for the common good. I think on the other hand, it's also about a kind of shifting ethics landscape for the producers of the city, and perhaps lastly, let's say within that framework, the notion of developing imaginaries for what this might be in terms of what are the qualitative possibilities of these shifts. And for me, I think that this space and the kind of the way that we are in a way using the space and exploring how that might propose a kind of more radical approach to new building, I think is a really exciting possibility. That is a way to inspire and also shift behavior and production.
Yes, also like with the idea of the building moratorium, it is kind of provocative, and at the beginning I was like, okay, what I'm going to do in the future, but to be honest, I see there is so much to do in the future for architects and planners, and maybe even more interesting. And the other thing is that I think if we want it or not, I think a big change will come. I'm just thinking of, I think this week they decided in Germany, or they didn't decide it, or they say that we need like 30 billion to build up the flooded area in North Rhine-Westphalia. And when we think of the wildfires in Greece and south of Europe, So I think we will live in a scarcity in the next years, and we have to prepare for that. And it's not about deciding it. I think it will happen automatically.
Well, I'm not so sure about this, to be honest. I mean, of course, as people in a certain profession, we need to convince people of things that we kind of know, or that are our expertise, that might help them to understand also where their role in society is, in the sense of probably I should not vote for a party any longer that accelerates growth and stuff like this. But then I would try to step back from the profession in a way, and as a citizen, and then it's the same role. So in every day we have to convince people that certain things are not working anymore. And I mean, where we are at the campaigning for Berlin election and German elections, it's a democracy. We have to talk with each other, and I would say that still the vast majority of people in Germany, and I'm not trying to say it's their fault, but they are voting for parties that will ruin our life, simply.
Thank you. This is a good final statement, nearly. I don't dare to. Well, I'm very much on the page with Saskia that, in fact, I think we really have to rethink what commons are. So our spaces as commons, materials as commons. So, but that is something which I would love to accelerate much more quickly. But I'm quite pessimistic that is something which is really a sort of one of the new narratives of imaginaries which we have to build, and also to really thoroughly think through, because nobody of us wants is go back to what has happened on this very spot here. So this notion of this fear of a communist state is something which we have also to take very seriously when we talk about common goods and how could we shape an economy which is much more based on commons. On the short term, I think something like what we have discussed, mandatory design for deconstruction, material passports, preservation of materials, CO2 price tags, it's all things which policy can implement very, very quickly. So there's nothing very magic about that. It's just a question of will. And I very much liked the idea we discussed yesterday about the building moratorium as a sort of intermediate step to really rethink how we build, and at the same time very quickly go for a demolition moratorium where we really start to cherish what we have and reimagine the spaces and which are already there, and where enormous value is, and where enormous also embedded carbon is, which we just simply not demolish, just for that reason.
Can I add one last
Yes.
thing? I think everything you said is, thank you very much for your inputs. That was super important and very inspiring to think further on the topic. I want to add one point that is on how to reach the change of policy. It's really about getting active ourselves. Elections are here, Tobias, you mentioned it before. It's not only policy makers that are responsible, but as well the society, the individual, and the government that then needs to implement it. So change needs to happen on a lot of levels. So we talked about the IPC6 when we were on the phone, Sabine. It's Friday for Futures is on the street every Friday, and that creates pressure. So it needs the communication of the topics that are important, and it needs people that create the pressure. So it's really worth, and I thank you very much for bringing up these topics and being a part of making this more visible. And I hope, Charlotte, we can go on with the moratorium thought and idea, and create more thinking space for that topic.
Great. Let's go on with that. I don't know how. We'll see. But maybe just one word about the kind of the moratorium as an idea. I think it's really something that also allows the conversation to shift towards more radical solution, because that's the kind of urgencies that we find ourselves into. So I would like to thank every one of you for taking the risk to join that panel today, where we're kind of trying to, let's say, move further with that, with those urgencies and try to address them. So thank you very much, and thank you for Angelika for joining the moderation. Fantastic. Thank you very much, and thanks to the audience.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, thank you for listening and for the invitation.
Enjoy the rest of the evening and the leftover drinks, I hope.